In the first generation, switching came at no cost other than the opportunity to use a move and having to withstand your opponent's move. But hey, that's why you were switching in the first place. However, from the second generation onwards, one may also take damage as they switch in, not from an opponent's move, but just for entering the battlefield. Entry hazards, as they're referred to, are an integral part of the game. The limitations imposed on the very backbone of competitive battling, switching, shape a great deal of how teams are built and battles are played. We've already made a video about the most famous or infamous entry hazard, Stealth Rock, but in the generations before rocks existed, there was another hazard, which we'll be exploring today: spikes. Spikes does not hit every non-Magic Guard Pokemon the way Stealth Rock does. It simply extends to every grounded Pokemon. It won't touch flying types, levitators, or those with an air balloon intact, unless gravity is active anyway. But gravity is gimmicky, and spikes are among the most tried and true strategies in history. Spikes is also unlike Stealth Rock in that it does not hit targets based on the type chart. Rocks are famous for ruining or at least hindering rock-weak Pokemon, but spikes, despite being a ground type move, do not have this effect. Everything they hit is hit for equal damage, and while the lack of super effective hits may seem disappointing at first, consider the massive upsides of hitting everything for the same damage. It doesn't matter if a Pokemon quadruple resists ground or not, it's still getting hit for 12.5% of its health, or perhaps even more, and given how most Pokemon are grounded, well, this can get out of hand quite quickly. This ties into another excellent aspect of spikes, the fact that it can be stacked for multiple layers used up to 3 times to really lay the hurt on opponents. A single layer of spikes can be bad enough, but when all 3 are on the field, switch-ins become a lot more pressured. Furthermore, spikes are immensely flexible. They are generally thought of as tools of slow-paced teams relying purely on passive damage, but they can also be stacked quickly and aggressively, overwhelming opponents with immediacy. In fact, this fast-paced strategy has been among the best in many metagames, often being its most reliable and defining, and sometimes even being too much. Spikes' introduction in the second generation was a far cry from the hazard we have known and loved in a certain form for so long. In Gen 2, there was just one layer of spikes, and while the most famous spikes user ever, Skarmory, was also around, it did not yet learn spikes. Instead, Cloyster and Fortress were your options. Well, technically Smeargle as well, but that was incredibly gimmicky and rare. That was by no means bad though, as Cloy and Fori were excellent. Cloyster so much so that it eventually shot up to number 3 in usage and viability, overtaking the previously unassailable Raikou, a legendary electric formerly so oppressive it had hidden power complex banned on it. Despite spikes being limited to one layer, it still completely ruled the roost in GSC. In fact, some players believed it to be downright required on every team. Simply put, even if it couldn't be used to hack entire teams to pieces like in other generations, the increments of damage were too crucial in such a bulky generation where hits were shrugged off so easily, most notably against Snorlax, against whom one had to take every source of damage they could get, no matter how small. It wasn't as simple as simply grabbing your spike and coasting though. One had to maneuver skillfully to reap the benefits. Spikes could be huge, but it required players to sustain pressure continuously over the course of a game, especially since rest, and a sleep talk that could successfully call rest for that matter, was so common. Furthermore, not every Pokemon was a good spikes abuser. For instance, Heracross, a Pokemon thwarted by the spike immune Zapdos and Skarmory, had very little use for spikes. Instead, you'd want to focus on Pokemon like Zapdos, Jynx, and Tyranitar, Electric, Ice, and Rock, hitting those pesky spike immune flying types super effectively. Even maintaining the spike was a matter of great detail and importance, as demonstrated in the spikes minigame that so many other metagames would go on to have. The rapid spinners attempting to remove the spikes, the dance of the spikers and spinners trying to beat each other, with occasionally hilarious results like Hidden Power Fire Fortress mirrors, and of course, ghost types blocking rapid spin. These tactics, including HP Fire Fortress, were on full display in the third generation, which brought spikes to the 3 layers max incarnation we still recognize it as today, and also gifted the move to Skarmory. Throw in permanent Sandstorm, more passive damage like Will-O-Wisp and buff Leech Seed, and much harder hitting Pokemon both due to power creep and the removal of max EVs across the board. Now spikes are doing more work on both sides of the spectrum, whether they're limiting walls from being able to take on threats or limiting the time the threats have to break through the walls, often both simultaneously. The effect spikes had on Gen 3 was so outrageous at times that yes, spikes is broken or Skarmory is broken because nobody was up in arms about Fortress, Cloyster, or Smeargle. But what was there to be done about it? Banning spikes outright, which isn't the last time that idea would be floated, seemed too extreme, as did banning Skarmory. Some players would rarely test metagames with spikes banned, but the overall effect was negative. An alternative solution was tossed around, one where spikes would be limited to one layer or even two. After all, the second layer of spikes was fine, but conventional wisdom dictated that unless one really needed it or could not guarantee the third layer, one was better off abusing one layer of spikes with another move on the turn the second spike would be used, like roaring with Skarmory for example. And this was because the second layer was not nearly as much of an upgrade to the first as the third layer was to the first two. Still, this didn't happen, and the effect was that yes, while non-spike strategies were obviously viable and in fact very good, the fact of the matter was that when two players had a battle that really mattered, odds were that they would both bring spikes, and more specifically, they would bring Skarmory. Skarm embodied all aspects of spikes, used defensively with its walling capabilities, used offensively with its phasing and other passive damage like Toxic and Sand, and even defending against spikes by being immune to them. That was another major introduction to the anti-spikes world in the third generation, so-called Superman teams, whose aim was to pack as many spikes immune Pokemon as possible to quote-unquote fly over the spikes opponents laid down. Rapid spinning could be such a drag after all. The spinners had good qualities but tended to falter in the face of the mighty Skarmory, as well as its best friend Gengar, and occasionally other pals like Dugtrio, Magneton, and or Pursuit Tyranitar. Why bother spinning when you could simply ignore the spikes instead? Was this feasible, you ask? Unlike Gen 2, yes. First of all, Gen 2 had few viable flying types, definitely not the case in Gen 3. Secondly, it wasn't just flying types anymore either. With the introduction of abilities, Levitate now blessed Pokemon like Gengar and Flygon with that all-important Spikes immunity. As such, it became quite feasible to build teams with as many as 4 Spikes immunities. Truly ambitious teams could maybe make it 5, and a select few went the whole 9 yards with 6 immunities. But by and large, that could create weaknesses elsewhere. 4 was the norm then, and these teams were optimized, geared perfectly towards maximum abuse of spikes combined with maximum protection from them, as many of the spikes immune Pokemon like Zapdos, Aerodactyl, Gengar, and Flygon lack spikes immune counters. Superman on Superman games were not rare, and their unique dynamic made for particularly interesting battles as they attempted to target the spikes vulnerable Pokemon and break the game open. Generation 4 saw similar dynamics, easier to abuse spikes on offense and defense with greater power and new Pokemon, but they were of course now complemented by Stealth Rocks. Rocks didn't outshine spikes, they enhanced them. You know those annoying flyers that hover above spikes? Well, have fun taking your super effective Rocks hit, Zapdos. It went the other way too. Rocks not wearing down that Jirachi all that well? Well, Spikes sure will. Rocks and Spikes abuse was always at the forefront of the metagame, and sometimes Toxic Spikes added themselves to the fray too. It wasn't tough to do, given that longtime Spiker Fortress now had T-Spikes as well, and Rocks for that matter, but that was something else. And additionally, there was a new Spiker in town, Roserade, which brought a unique, excellent defensive profile to its spiking sets. With all the Rocks and Spikes to go alongside Permanent Sand once again, passive damage was at an all-time high. Rapid spinning was popular, and for a time that classic Spikes minigame was strongly at play, most notably Pursuit Tyranitar attempting to Pursuit Starmie the spinner, and Rotom the spin blocker for the benefit of its own team spiking and spinning. But eventually it too gave away to a metagame focused on ignoring spikes more than it spun them. While flyers like Zapdos could no longer fit on these teams, there were plenty of new candidates like Gliscor, Bronzong, Magikarp Clefable, Latias, and the Rotom appliances. Spikes were so powerful, they would now find themselves being used by offensive leads whose entire purpose was to lay down the spikes for the benefit of its teammates. Yes, sure, leads with Rocks and Spikes were great, most notably offensive Skarmory in OU, as well as Deoxys speed when it was allowed, but we're talking pure Spikes leads, like Frostlass in UU, OU, and Ubers, or like Deoxys speed also often was in Ubers. Spikes in fact was why Deoxys speed was canned from OU, and why Frostlass got the boot from UU. They were too good at spiking. Not even Skarmory could boast this. Still, spikes themselves were just about never under the gun in Gen 4. But in Gen 5, that changed. All of OU, Ubers, and UU had at varying points serious, genuine complaints about the presence of spikes in the tier, most prominently in OU. At first, this was mostly thanks to the new spiking monster that was Ferrothorn, which walled seemingly everything and spiked and leech seeded everything in sight, aided and abetted beautifully by best friend Jellicent, who blocked spin, absorbed fire and fighting moves, and distributed burns for it. It was easier than ever for nearly every team to spike, whether Skarmory, Fortress, or Ferrothorn. While there were good rapid spinners, the spikers were so good, they had no problem spiking over and over and over and over, and you get the idea. Deoxys speed was once again banned from OU for spiking too well for offensive teams, and eventually so was Deoxys defense. Deoxys defense had previously been UU, and there the idea of banning spikes was genuinely thrown around in Black and White 1, as the insane power of Deoxys defense, Rose Raid, and Frostlass would also be banned later, dominated the tier so much that the player base genuinely began to question the health of spikes, as they warped everything to extents that were considered absurd. Eventually, OU Spikes abuse also went the way of the Superman, as Magic Guard abuse came to the forefront with two insane new abusers in Reuniclus and Alakazam, abusers whose counters tended to be Spikes weak themselves. This strategy was so monstrously broken and had such an absurd stranglehold on the metagame that unprecedented complex bans were put into place so Excadrill could be unbanned and offer an actually viable rapid spinner beyond Rain Dish Tentacruel. Sorry, an actually viable rapid spinner that wasn't completely stuffed by Jellicent. Oh, never mind. Those teams didn't need Jellicent spin blocking. They just outlast Excadrill with Skarmory anyway, and Excadrill and its teammates would collapse under the pressure over the course of the metagame before being mercilessly finished off by Alakazam or Reuniclus. Generation 6 came around with its buff Defog, and everyone briefly thought that was the end of spikes. You can't block Defog like Ghost can block Rapid Spin. Well, technically Taunt can, but you can't switch in a Taunt Pokemon to prevent a Defog from going off. Thus, spikes were more or less forgotten early on. The exception was Deoxys speed or defense hyper offense with Bisharp in the back, as Bisharp's defiant ability would punish attempts to defog away Deoxys' spikes with a free +2 attack. The strategy was immensely successful, but pretty much the only use of spikes in early XY, and it didn't last, as both Deoxys forms were eventually banned. However, spikes made a comeback in late XY. No more permanent sand to abuse alongside the spikes. Yeah, who cares? They still hacked everything apart, as people realized the already terrifying Greninja could use spikes to make itself even harder to counter. It was why specially defensive Clefable popped up as an answer to it. It was the only one not hacked apart by spikes, and as people realized that Ferrothorn still walled absolutely everything, this development exploded into spikes abuse so extreme that it'd make even Gen 5 raise an eyebrow in Oraz, even after Greninja was banned. It was just the easiest thing ever to stack them to the ceiling with Ferrothorn or Skarmory. Defog? Yeah, about that. Turns out all the defoggers were either terrible or insanely easy to exploit, whether through the spikers themselves or with teammates like Pursuit Tyranitar. Rapid Spin Starmie started getting popular in an attempt to quell Spikes' influence. Yeah, same deal. Spikes abuse became an incredibly dominant strategy to the point of defining the metagame. And yes, again, Superman style teams were at the forefront. Generation 7 was similar in this regard, though its spiking got more and more aggressive with the reintroduction of Greninja, especially with how splashable the Battle Bond set was. Greninja and Ferrothorn continued Spikes' dominance in OU, even in Ultra Sun and Moon, when suddenly everything seemed to get defogged. Teams abusing spikes, fast, medium, and slow paced alike, were the life force of the tier, as if dealing with threats like Magearna, Kartana, and Tapu Lele wasn't scary enough as is. It seemed like spikes would go on in this vein forever, but an enormous paradigm shift came in Generation 8 with the introduction of heavy duty boots. Furthermore, Rapid Spin was buffed to boost speed as well. However, in spite of these two changes seemingly designed to snuff them down, spikes have not really slowed down. Yeah, sure, you can be immune to them, but you better watch out for knockoff, a move which is absolutely everywhere, including on Ferrothorn itself. Once your boots are spent, you'll be as vulnerable to spikes as ever. Plus, there are plenty of important power that are still spikes vulnerable because they need to run other items. Yeah, Specs, Dragapult, and Banned Tyranitar are scary, but they're scary in a way that means they can't be immune to spikes. The addition of boots was a blessing given the change in Generation 9, where spikes has been given to just about every ground type around. In any other generation except maybe 8, the likes of Spikes, Garchomp, and Gliscor would make everyone go ballistic. Well, in Gliscor's case, people still do, but that's because of Gliscor itself as a whole. The fact that Spikes is something it can do is unique, as opposed to the complete metagame warping effect this would have had previously. It's not just those two Pokemon that were already superstars either. The likes of Spikes, Gastrodon, and Quagsire would be absolutely enormous in other generations. They're still incredibly important, of course, even with boots as prominent as they are, for the same reasons as Gen 8. Even with knockoffs relatively limited distribution, there is still the whole dynamic of if you don't run boots, you will be affected by Spikes, and that effect is so huge that they are still a massive part of the metagame. Overall, Spikes are pretty much always going to be a big deal, generation after generation, and this is just with us mostly focusing on OU. We mentioned other tiers, but we had to hold back, lest we mentioned that incredible power of Spikes in Gen 5 RU. For example, they are so strong that they have been lobbied against and despised for decades at this point. But here's how good Spikes is, actually. Any Pokemon with Spikes not only receives a glance of viability. For instance, Glalie is genuinely viable in Gen 3 OU because of this. So all in all, Spikes are right up there with Stealth Rock as the most notorious entry hazard, which is fitting for the oldest of them all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about Spikes? Do you think it's as good as Stealth Rock? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.